Dr. John West.
Well, if I didn't provoke you enough in my first talk, maybe I'll provoke you more here, or maybe not. For those of you who are watching online, less for people here, because those of you here know it, if you're here, you actually could get a copy of the book, The Magician's Twin, for free if you just sign up. But you also will get a PDF of something called The Rise of Totalitarian Science that I wrote, that if you end up being interested in this talk, you might want to look at that. And so if you're online, you can't get the physical book, The Magician's Twin, but if you go to discovery.org/Lewis, for C.S. Lewis, discovery.org/Lewis, and sign up for our Faith and Science newsletter, you will get that PDF document, The Rise of Totalitarian Science. So with that commercial, I'll get in. Over the past couple of years, we've all heard a common refrain in public life from public officials in the media. We need to make decisions based on science, okay? Science, not politics, must be the guide. I mean, I actually had a whole list of exact quotes of what has appeared. These comments, of course, were being made in reference to fighting COVID-19, but I think they actually represent a much more widespread sentiment that has been growing over the past few decades. Since 2017, more than 1 million people around the world have joined annual March for Science protests in hundreds of cities around the globe. These protesters' self-professed mission is, quote, to mobilize advocates around the world in support of evidence-based, science-informed public policies, unquote. Some of the protesters have proclaimed an almost messianic vision of scientists and society, exemplified by one of their slogans, scientists pursuing truth, that's a good thing, saving the world, okay? During the COVID era, we saw this messianic vision of science in a rewrite of the national motto that became popular on social media. Our national motto, of course, is In God We Trust. In this rewrite, the motto became In Fauci We Trust. God gets replaced by a scientist. Now, I want to say, this messianic vision of science is in many respects perfectly understandable. Anyone who takes an aspirin or uses an iPhone appreciates the benefits of modern science. I certainly do. Science has produced wonder-working drugs and miraculous inventions. It's led to staggering increases in both personal freedom and wealth. My dad remained alive and healthy past his 100th birthday because of advances in medical science that cured him of colon cancer twice. We enjoy fresh fruits and vegetables. Actually, we had some for lunch year-round. I mean, if you were doing 200 years ago, probably almost into November, you wouldn't be enjoying so many fresh fruits and vegetables. Year-round, we enjoy them because of technological innovations in transportation and refrigeration. People of all classes now have instantaneous access to vast online libraries that would make the fabled Library of Alexandria look provincial. Given these almost magical powers of science, the seductive appeal with what C.S. Lewis called Scientocracy, rule of society by scientists, is undeniable. Why not trust scientists to lead us? Why not replace or at least modify representative democracy with a society where decisions about public policy are made by neutral experts exercising their scientific expertise? Many Americans might well agree. According to a Pew Forum survey pre-COVID in 2019, so just as we were about to go into the COVID pandemic, according to this national survey, the number of people in America who had a great deal of confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public rose an astonishing 67% from 2016 to 2019. In 2019, Americans trusted scientists more than they did religious leaders, sorry, Pastor Rich, the military, the news media, business leaders, and public school principals. Just had to throw that in there. That was the list that they asked people about. And yet, as important as scientific expertise is to solving problems, I think handing over authority to unelected scientific experts is deeply problematic. In 1958, C.S. Lewis wrote an essay that I think everyone should read on the dangers of Scientocracy that I think really should be required reading for Christians and others. Lewis's essay was titled "Willing Slaves of the Welfare State." In that essay, he said this: "I dread government in the name of science. That is how tyrannies come in. In every age, the men who want us under their thumb, if they have any sense, will put forward the particular pretension which the hopes and fears of that age render most potent. They cash in. It has been magic. It has been Christianity. Now it will certainly be science." Lewis also predicted the new oligarchy must more and more base its claim to plan us on its claim to knowledge. This means they must increasingly rely on the advice of scientists till in the end the politicians proper become merely the scientists' puppets. I think Lewis was eerily prophetic. You don't need to look far today to see science being misused as a wedge for authoritarianism, or even what I've called totalitarian science, science that's so totalistic in its outlook that its defenders claim the right to remake every sphere of human life, from public policy and family to education to ethics and religion. Let's take the area of ecology, where some scientists are proposing draconian measures to protect biodiversity. For example, I have another Texas example. I know there's at least one person who introduced themselves to me who's from Texas who's here, but if you're also online watching from Texas, you probably know this example. Your University of Texas state taxpayer-paid evolutionary zoologist Eric Pianka, who asserts with his state-funded, taxpayer-funded salary that we must reduce the Earth's human population by up to 90%, and he calls on government to confiscate all the earnings, yes, all the earnings of any couple who has more than 2 children. And I'm not even going to get into his more controversial comments about whether the Ebola virus would be a great way to get rid of people, because later he said, oh, I was just saying it would be effective. He wasn't actually advocating it, so I'll put that to a side. In any case, consider another example in the area of criminal justice. The presumption of innocence and the right to confront your accusers, which I actually think, if you know the Bible's view of criminal justice, is actually very biblical. These have been hallmarks of a civilized criminal justice system. But they are now under serious attack. In the name of science, judges across the United States are deciding who stays in jail based on computer algorithms that purport to predict, scientifically, whether an accused person will reoffend. These algorithms are confidential because they're often made by private for-profit entities with academic scientists who are consulting with them on, to make money, additional money on the side. So they're private and confidential algorithms, and not even judges or defense attorneys are allowed to review their underlying assumptions. Judges and defense attorneys are just supposed to trust the scientific expertise of those who wrote the algorithm, who are actually hired by the prosecutors. Another example, in the area of medicine, decisions about medical care once left to patients and their families are increasingly made by doctors, hospitals, and even the government in the name of superior scientific expertise. Patients or families who disagree now find that they have little or no say over life or death decisions. If a doctor or hospital decides that your child does not merit further treatment, not only will you have no power to override their decision, you may even be prohibited from seeking medical treatment for your child in another facility. Take the case of Alfie Evans in 2018 in the United Kingdom. The parents of baby Alfie wanted to pursue additional medical treatment for their son. Doctors at their government hospital refused. So the parents found a hospital and doctors in another country willing to provide treatment. But the UK government forbade them from taking their son to a new hospital, basically imposing a death sentence on baby Alfie. It was justified as deference to medical experts, to scientific expertise, even though there were other scientific medical experts who disagreed. Well, you said, that's England, it couldn't happen here. Well, in our own country, we had the case of teenager Justina Pelletier, who was institutionalized part of the time in a psychiatric ward, against her will and against the will of her parents for 16 months in Boston. Why? Well, because a hospital doctor in Boston disagreed with the diagnosis of Justina's own doctor from Tufts University And when Justina and her parents had the audacity to follow the advice of their own doctor, Justina's parents were charged by the state with medical child abuse because the hospital said, oh, this is just in her mind. It's not really the disease that the other doctor thinks. And when they wanted to side with their original doctor from Tufts University, oh, nope, that's medical child abuse. And Justina, who was, again, something like 16, was then forcibly incarcerated and denied medical treatment that she wanted for 16 months. Then there is the realm of public health, where some experts increasingly assert the right to rule without any real check on their authority. And of course, probably the most example that might be in your mind is during the COVID crises, we've seen public health officials claim the authority to impose long shutdowns on much of society, including churches, in many cases for more than a year. Finally, and also in the name of science and expertise, many are abandoning a commitment to free speech. Prior to COVID, I want you to understand this, these trends were happening before COVID. COVID actually manifested many of these things, but they had been building. So prior to COVID, you had Professor Lawrence Torsello at the Rochester Institute of Technology arguing that global warming skeptics should be charged with criminal negligence. Journalist Adam Weinstein said that they should face jail, this direct quote, they should face fines, they should face lawsuits because they disagree about the causes of warming or how much it's warming. That's a crime. So if you believe that, I think, and you understand that just how much that view was percolating up, you might understand better what we're facing now. So in the COVID era, of course, attacks on free speech in the name of science have multiplied exponentially in the name of combating misinformation. Our current US president and Surgeon General have actively pressured journalists and tech companies to censor messages they regard as COVID-19 misinformation. Taxpayer-funded National Public Radio has all but urged licensing boards to strip medical licenses from doctors who offer dissenting COVID-19 opinions. California has just enacted a law against doctors that could do that actually authorizes the state medical licensing board to pull the licenses of doctors who are spreading misinformation, which is very interesting if you actually look in the bill. It really isn't against misinformation. It's against, they define misinformation as basically inaccurate or false information, even if it's spread unintentionally, that goes against the consensus view. So which means that if you're spreading false information that is supported by a consensus view, that's not actually misinformation, and you can't be penalized for that. So it's not really even, it really isn't a bill about misinformation. It's a bill to basically stop dissenting views. And that's now the law in California. The CEO of Pfizer has branded those circulating criticisms of his company's vaccines as, quote, criminals because they have literally cost millions of lives, unquote. You disagree with his vaccines, you're a mass murderer. Lost in current discussions is the fact that much so-called misinformation represents either sincere and inaccurate claims, there are lots of inaccurate claims, or legitimate differences of opinion held by scientists and policy experts where it might not exactly be clear what is completely true or not. Still, other pieces of so-called misinformation, and this is where it gets really disturbing, are actually true facts that those in charge really can't dispute, but would rather not deal with. For example, it is a fact, not fiction, not speculation, not a conspiracy theory, that the government's own vaccine adverse event reporting system, VAERS, has had more adverse reaction reports filed for the COVID-19 vaccines than for any other vaccine since it started collecting data in 1990. We have 30 years of data, but only one set of vaccines that have just outstripped it. So indeed, according to the latest data, actually as of about October 14th, I think this is the latest batch, 62% of all adverse reactions, 68% of all hospitalizations, and 77% of all deaths reported to VAERS. That covers every vaccine that's being used for the past 30 years. 77% of all deaths reported are now related to the COVID-19 vaccines. That's a fact. Now, yes, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. And so what this actual factual data means can and should be debated and discussed. But the fact that the data exists in the federal government's official database is unquestionable. Yet if you spent much time discussing VAERS in social media or on YouTube, you are likely to be banned. It gets worse. In the name of protecting the public from misinformation, tech companies have been blocking citizens' access to their elected officials' statements and deliberations about science and public policy. So they're not just censoring doctors, they're not just censoring ordinary people, they're actually censoring public officials. In one notorious case, hearings and expert panels convened by United States Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin have been repeatedly censored by YouTube because they featured scientists and experts who offered evidence-based critiques of current COVID policies. Yes, there is misinformation in public discussions of COVID and many other topics. That's part and parcel of being in a fallen world. I mean, free speech was never established because you could only have true speech. I mean, there is misinformation. Some of it comes from private parties. Some of it actually has come from government officials. Let me just give you one example. And I know you may have your own examples, but I like the examples I'm citing because the ones I'm citing are pretty much, these are so mainstream, you cannot reasonably dispute these examples. And so when scientist Francis Collins was still the head of the National Institutes of Health, NIH, he gave a public interview where he tried, actually it was targeted towards evangelical Christians. It was an interview, as I recall, with Russell Moore, where he was trying to sell the new vaccines. And so he was trying to allay fears that mRNA vaccines might be unsafe because they inject foreign mRNA into the body that could linger there. Here's what Collins said at that interview, the public interview. It's on YouTube, still on YouTube. Quote, "The RNA lives a very short time in your body. It is quickly degraded because the RNA has a very short half-life. So there's no residual of what you've been injected with beyond probably a few hours," unquote. Under the banner of fighting misinformation, this same message was spread far and wide by other health authorities. For example, the Center for Disease Control's website stated that mRNA from the vaccines will disappear from the body within a few days. The respected Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center likewise claimed vaccine mRNA will disappear, quote, in about 72 hours, unquote. This statement appeared on a web page devoted to debunking myths about COVID-19 vaccines. It doesn't appear there anymore because I actually contacted them, asked them how they could justify it, and cited something I'm about to tell you. But these things, this was all over the internet for more than a year. This claim that you didn't need to be worried because the RNA just flushed out of your system quickly. Turns out that these claims made in the very name of fighting misinformation now appear to be misinformation themselves. Earlier this year, a peer-reviewed research article was published by the science journal Cell, one of the world's top molecular biology journals. The article was authored by pro-vaccine researchers at Stanford University and elsewhere. So they weren't anti-vaccine, they weren't anti-COVID vaccines. But as part of their researchers, they were trying to track other things, and as part of it, they were tracking how long the mRNA from the vaccines persisted in the body. Contrary to Francis Collins' previous assertion, the mRNA did not disappear in a few hours, a few days, or even a few weeks. In fact, mRNA from the vaccine persisted in the person's lymph system some 2 months after vaccination. We actually don't know how much longer it lasted because that's only how long the researchers tracked it. So Francis Collins' statement, and he's been one of the people who actually has advocated potentially criminal and other penalties for people who engage in misinformation. Francis Collins' own statement, which was spread by other government scientists and medical organizations, now appears to be misinformation. So am I arguing, like Francis Collins does, that he should be criminally prosecuted for that? Of course not, because I understand, and I hope we all do, that in a free society, the appropriate way to combat misinformation is by adding speech, not punishing it. As Christian writer John Milton wrote famously, one of the most classic really defenses of the idea of free speech, we are wrong to restrict free speech because we misdoubt the strength of truth in open debate. Let her, truth, and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the worst, in a free and open encounter. I think these examples that I've given of what I would call creeping authoritarianism in the name of science should concern all of us, wherever we fall on the political spectrum. And so I'd like to offer 5 reasons first for why this drift towards Scientocracy is such a terrible idea, and then I'm going to offer several suggestions of how I think we should address it. So reason 1, so standing back from the examples and giving some broader concepts here. Reason 1 why Scientocracy really is not a great idea. Reason 1 is scientists aren't nearly as objective or neutral as people seem to think. And I want to make clear, I know we have scientists in the audience here. Scientists are wonderful people. The danger about talking about this is it's like you're coming out, well, you're just bashing scientists. I'm not actually trying to do that. My underlying point is that scientists are just as human as everyone else. And so the same checks and balances that apply to everyone, scientists should not be immune from that, especially when they make claims about the use of government power and restricting other people. But to get to that, we need to address, I think, some of these misconceptions. And so number 1, this reason is scientists aren't nearly as objective or neutral as people have thought. Far too many Americans, at least pre-COVID, accepted what I would call the myth of the scientist in the white lab coat. That is, when they think about scientists, they visualize people in white lab coats who had been trained to be impartial, factual, objective. And this really is people's image. This goes back a few years now, but if you remember when President Obama had Obamacare, you may or may not remember, but he held a press conference. And during that press conference, it was with medical personnel. And so they basically handed out white lab coats to these people so that the pictures would show him introducing at the press conference with all these people in white lab coats. They had them there and just handed it out to people. Because though his political consultants know that we do have this idea, scientists, white lab coat, objective, neutral. According to one survey, nearly 2/3 of Americans see scientists as neither particularly liberal nor conservative. They think of them as nonpartisan and neutral. Sorry to say, and there are always exceptions, but we have really good empirical evidence that this is not true. A nationwide survey of 2,500 plus scientists conducted by Pew Forum in conjunction with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a very mainstream group, very trusted survey, unequivocally showed that scientists as a group are far from neutral or nonpartisan on a range of issues. Consider political ideology. 52% of scientists classify themselves as politically liberal. Only 9% classify themselves as conservative. That makes scientists 4 times less likely than the general public to identify as conservatives. And it makes scientists 2.6 times more likely to identify as liberals as the general public. Or let's look at party affiliation. A whopping 6% of scientists identify as Republicans, whereas 55% as Democrats. Again, completely unrepresentative of the population as a whole, even in a state like Washington. But it's not just political ideology where scientists aren't representative of the general public in America. They are even less representative in the area of religion. According to the latest Gallup survey, we are having a decline in the number of people who actually believe in God in America, but nonetheless, 81% of the general public in America still believes in God. 33% of scientists do. Think about that. Religion, our faith, impacts our deepest views about the world and what's important. Yet there's a cavernous gulf in this area between most scientists and most of the general public. The bottom line is that when dealing with pronouncements from scientists on public policy, let alone culture, people need to understand that there is little neutral about scientists as a class. In particular, they are grossly unrepresentative of the population as a whole, unrepresentative ideologically, politically, and yes, religiously. It is therefore questionable to treat scientists as a class as if they are necessarily objective or impartial whenever they speak on public policy or culture. Many may try to be. And when I engage in scientists, I was giving a version of this talk at a university in Hawaii a month before, and there were some of the people from the biology department who were listening, and they got really upset. I stayed afterwards, and we had a very nice conversation. But they thought, oh, you're demonizing scientists. And their point is, well, you can have those beliefs, but you can also try to be objective. Yes, that is true. I get that. They may try to be. But the simple fact of the matter is that your underlying worldview cannot help but impact the rest of your views. And so is it really wise to delegate public authority, which is what this talk is about, should scientists rule, should we delegate public authority to a group that is so unrepresentative of the public as a whole? Okay, second reason why Scientocracy is such a bad idea. Science actually, and scientists themselves, the best scientists, they know this, not all their public spokespeople know this, but science is a lot more fallible than its boosters claim. The promoters of basing public policy on science seem supremely confident in the ability of scientists to accurately arrive at the truth in a timely manner. And again, scientists do have many amazing achievements to their credit. Science is a wonderful thing. And I know that given what I'm talking about here, you may say, oh, I'm just bashing science. No, I'm not. Science is a wonderful thing. But it's a human enterprise. So scientists also have many stupendous failures. Science is many things. An infallible oracle it is not. If you've been following the news at all closely during the COVID era, I don't really need to tell you this. In the space of weeks, we saw how various expert projections of catastrophic numbers of deaths and hospitalizations turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Yes, many people have died from COVID, including more than 1 million in the United States. But the initial projections that millions of people in America would die within months, that was the initial projections. In 2 to 3 months, you're going to have millions of deaths, and all the hospitals were going to be overrun within days. Those projections turned out to be catastrophically wrong. And those were the projections that were used to base on sort of very long-term shutdowns. Or consider this. In January 2020, many weeks after COVID had erupted in China, the World Health Organization was still insisting that, quote, there was no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission, unquote. Of course, that assurance also turned out to be wrong. COVID-19 is highly contagious between humans. Another example, we went from scientists insisting repeatedly that masks were useless to being told that masks were so critical that they must be mandated even for those who were vaccinated, even for those who didn't have underlying health problems. We went from the nation's most authoritative scientist and public health figure, Dr. Anthony Fauci, telling us on national television that COVID-19 wouldn't be a problem, that it was perfectly safe to go on cruise ships, to the gym, to movie theaters, to being told we all needed to be locked down in our homes for months on end or disaster would ensue. The thing is, anyone who knows anything about the history of science will be able to tell you that these kinds of scientific failures are not exceptional. Again, science is a human enterprise. These are a normal part of science and of academic expertise in general. And they're not in and of themselves bad. They're bad, though, if you're trying to absolutize the claims you're making at any given point without realizing that, well, maybe you don't actually have absolute evidence to make your absolute claims. Let me give some other non-COVID examples. One is eugenics. In the early decades of the 20th century, America's leading biologists had the bright idea that they could breed better humans through what was known as eugenics. Eugenics was the effort to direct human evolution through forced sterilization and other methods. These scientists turned out to be wrong, and later scientists regarded eugenics as little more than junk science. Another tragic fad in the name of science was the lobotomy. A lobotomy is brain surgery where they sever the connections in your prefrontal cortex. They actually use a modified ice pick to sort of move around in there. In the 1940s, lobotomies were marketed, and I know about this. And if you want more detail on particularly the history of things like this, read my book, and this I guess will be a plug, Darwin Day in America. You'll find a lot about the history of eugenics, about lobotomies. What's really interesting about lobotomies is in the 1940s, if you actually look at the way it was justified in the literature, and I went back and dug into literature, lobotomies were marketed as a miracle cure for mental illness by leading scientists who promoted them as, quote, always safe, unquote. Someone even won a Nobel Prize for helping to develop the procedure. By the 1950s, an estimated 50,000 Americans were lobotomized. But then it turned out that it could render people severely incapacitated and that the procedure had many more side effects than originally believed. Okay, here's a more recent example of a failure involving science and technology. As I mentioned earlier, there is a movement to use computer algorithms to predict who will reoffend in the criminal justice system. In 2014, Los Angeles County used an algorithm to try to predict which children were at the highest risk for child abuse from their families. It was sold in the name of science. And I want to say, again, I come on as passionate, so maybe I'm not dismissing we don't want children abused. And we certainly don't want, the families where that is occurring, we do want to know about that and try to intervene. But again, they sold this algorithm that was based on, we put in these factors we won't tell you, and we spit out something that gives you an index. Well, this family, they're going to be child abusers. Well, how did it work out? Well, the algorithm did correctly produce abuse in 171 cases. But it falsely predicted abuse in 3,829 cases. In other words, it was wrong 96% of the time. It's not, then the trial went over and then they decided not to use it after that. Or let's think even in purely scientific beliefs that may not implicate society so clearly can turn out to be dramatically in error. And last night I gave an example, so I'll just touch on it here briefly. For years it was the consensus view that proteins that don't code for proteins were functionless junk DNA, leftovers from the haphazard process of blind evolution. In a stunning reversal, however, now increasingly scientists believe that much of so-called junk DNA does perform biological functions, including very important biological functions. The belief that most of our genome consisted of junk may turn out to be one of the biggest scientific blunders of the past century. By the way, one of the boosters of this, what is turning out to be false, was none other than Francis Collins in his book, The Language of God. So again, science is not so infallible as its boosters in public policy try to claim. Third reason Scientocracy is such a bad idea. Science isn't as self-critical or self-correcting as its defenders insist. Again, because it's a human enterprise. We're told sometimes in the media and by some of the biggest public boosters of science that science is so wonderful because it's so self-critical and self-correcting. Not always. Once you've invested, this is true for non-scientists who are academics, if you've invested your career in something and it turns out to be wrong, as my friend David Berlinski sort of said, why would you want to admit that? That's not a very thing for a fallible human being to do. Anyway, let's take the Eugenics Crusade again. Eugenics wasn't just promoted by a handful of fringe scientists. For decades, it was the consensus view of the scientific community in America and Europe, pushed uncritically by evolutionary biologists and other scientists at Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Yale, the University of Washington, the National Academy of Sciences. And the most vocal critics of eugenics weren't actually really outstanding scientists. They were either non-scientists or more fringe scientists who were people of faith, Catholics and evangelical Christians, who were accused of being anti-science because they dared criticize the scientific consensus on eugenics. What finally killed eugenics wasn't the scientific community, but revulsion from the public after post-World War II revelations about the Nazi eugenics program. Now, let me give you a more recent example of just how uncritical the science establishment can be. In May of 2020, one of the world's oldest and most prestigious peer-reviewed medical journals, The Lancet, published a study claiming to show that not only did the drug hydroxychloroquine not work to reduce COVID-19 deaths, but it actually increased deaths. This study's claims immediately had the impact of stopping other clinical trials by the World Health Organization, and that was devastating to legitimate efforts to determine whether hydroxychloroquine was actually an effective treatment or not. And I'm not entering into the debate of whether it is and isn't. My point is about the impact of this study that claimed that hydroxychloroquine was killing many more people, and so it stopped the effort to evaluate it. But then we found out more. So The Lancet, again, is one of the world's top medical journals, top peer-reviewed medical journals. It purported to base its findings in this article on a massive data set of 96,000 patients from a company called Surgisphere. This article went through peer review, was published, but then internet activists, the kind who end up getting censored and shut down, began raising questions, especially a guy named James Todaro, who had a medical degree from Columbia University, but he was considered on the fringe. He was raising stuff. The bottom line is that this article now appears to have been a giant hoax perpetrated by a fake company with fake researchers. And people may have died because of this fake article because it stopped other research into into that drug. One news outlet reported, a search of publicly available material suggests that several of Surgisphere's employees have little or no data or scientific background. An employee listed as science editor appears to be a science fiction author and fantasy artist whose professional profile suggests writing is her full-time job. Another employee listed as their marketing executive is an adult model and events hostess who also acts in videos. Now, yes, this study was then eventually retracted, but it was rejected largely in spite of the mainstream scientific community, which initially tried to dig in their heels, which initially had approved the research. And it was because of the dissenters who focused on this issue that then a reevaluation had to occur. Okay, fourth reason Scientocracy is so bad is that science is increasingly and illegitimately being used as a pretext to override ethical norms without debate. So there's sort of a bait and switch. Well, science says, therefore, this is right or wrong. You can see an example of this with Nancy Snyderman, who's the former chief medical editor for NBC News. In 2015, she publicly defended killing handicapped babies through abortion on the basis of science. Quote, this was her words, I am pro-science, so I believe that this, abortion, is a great way to prevent diseases, unquote. Science was being used as a trump card in debates over the ethics of abortion. I mean, even if it were what she said was true about, well, it's a great way to prevent diseases, the idea that killing, I mean, again, she's extrapolating from her views of science to make pronouncements on ethics. You've seen this year. Leading science journals have similarly been misusing the label science in debates over the overturning of Roe v. Wade. For example, one of the world's top science journals, which is in fact named Science, it's published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, published an article titled, "The Court is Ignoring Science," which tried to claim that it was anti-science to overturn Roe v. Wade. Forget constitutional law, forget ethical reasons. It was against science. Another especially egregious case came from the Obama administration's mandate on employers to include potentially abortion-inducing drugs in their health care plans. According to the Obama administration at the time, the mandate was required by science. Thus, employers, including many religious employers, had to be compelled to provide drugs that may induce abortions. End of discussion. Well, it really shouldn't be the end of discussion. I think a further example of science being misused to silence and override legitimate ethical debates is the controversy over compulsory COVID-19 vaccines. Now, my intent here is not to enter into the debate about whether people should have voluntarily been vaccinated. I merely want to point out that coerced medical treatment raises a slew of ethical concerns. And post-World War II, because of the Nazi experience, American society achieved a moral bipartisan consensus against coercive medical treatment and favoring patient rights. In less than 2 years, that consensus basically has been swept away in the name of science with very little debate about the ethics. Whatever your opinion of the COVID vaccines, that complete trashing of previous ethical norms in the name of science should concern you. And I'd actually say if you were really favoring the vaccines and are vaccinated and really thought that people should get it, that should concern you all the more, these claims of coercion that are sweeping away a couple generations worth of a consensus dealing with medical coercion. Okay, fifth final reason Scientocracy is bad is an extension of the last one. Scientists have tunnel vision. Scientists aren't experts in everything, and they tend to focus on the things they know, just like all of us. That's admirable when it comes to their scientific research, or it can be. But it's a disaster when it comes to public policy. Let's take COVID-19 policy, and if I had my PowerPoint or keynote here, you would actually see a collection of screen grabs that show examples of all these things. But deaths from COVID-19 are terrible. I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But so are deaths from depression, child abuse, untreated cancer, many other things. So are violations of free speech, free assembly, free exercise of religion. So is the lack of in-person human interactions, especially for children. So is the taking away of people's livelihoods. My point here is that public policy is rarely, if ever, about pursuing one good to the exclusion of all others. It requires reconciling competing goods. Yet scientists aren't moral philosophers, and they aren't experts in everything, so they have no special expertise in how to reconcile competing goods. Again, C.S. Lewis was quite wise here, and here's what he wrote. I dread specialists in power because they are specialists speaking outside their special subjects. Let scientists tell us about sciences, but government involves questions about the good for man, and justice, and what things are worth having at what price. And on these, a scientific training gives a man's opinion no added value. So that's the problem. What's my suggested antidote to this drive towards Scientocracy? So I have 5 briefer suggestions, 5 problems. Number 1, practice healthy skepticism. Good science isn't determined by decree, it's determined by the evidence. Just because a scientist makes a claim doesn't mean they are right. As my friend John Lennox of Oxford University likes to say, nonsense remains nonsense even when talked about by world-famous scientists. So when a scientist makes a claim in order to demand new laws or regulations or government spending, they should be asked to explain the evidence backing up their views. You don't have to just accept their assertions. Here's a second way to counter Scientocracy. Defend free speech in science. For all the talk of scientific consensus, science advances when scientists are free to raise new ideas and criticize old ones. English philosopher John Stuart Mill stressed this in his book On Liberty, that freedom to disagree should apply to science just like to any other discipline, no matter how sacrosanct the scientific theory. Here's what Mill wrote. The beliefs which we have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest on, but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded. If you want to really stop the progress of science, by all means, shut down the right of the dissenter. Do what the social media giants have done and remove videos or tweets, even by doctors and scientists, if they raise uncomfortable questions or make arguments you don't like. But don't claim you are defending science. Censorship is a recipe for stopping progress in science, not advancing it. Third way to push back on Scientocracy. Insist that policymakers recruit scientists who disagree. This is probably, of my 5 suggestions, I think really the most important one. Government scientists engaged in crafting public policy get flabby when they are treated like the voice of God. No, with all due respect to Dr. Fauci, it's not in Fauci we trust. It now appears that a couple of government scientists convinced the United States government in 2020 to urge a national shutdown based largely on a faulty model issued by the Imperial College in the UK. Other epidemiologists were skeptical, but they didn't have a voice in the process. Politicians may not have had the resources to ask experts tough questions themselves, and I understand that. But that's why they should recruit a diverse group of experts who can question and challenge each other. How different would our policies probably have been if Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx in particular, who were the 2 most influential government scientists, were forced to be with Jay Bhattacharya, Scott Atlas, others in the same room and duke it out. So they could make their assertions, but then they'd have fellow experts who could either refute or confirm them. And then the policymakers could make a decision. So like I said, I think this is really, really key. 4th proposal to counter Scientocracy. Hold scientists accountable for misconduct. If you care about the authority of science, if you want scientists to be trusted in public policy, you need to care about cleaning up misconduct. When scientists, especially scientists who wield political authority, engage in misrepresentation, a lack of candor, conflicts of interest, lack of transparency, they need to be challenged. Let me just give you a few concrete examples of what I'm talking about. Scott Gottlieb is a physician. He headed the FDA during the first 2 years of the Trump administration. The FDA regulates drug companies like Pfizer. After Scott Gottlieb left the federal government, he became a board member of Pfizer. Now, I don't mean to pick on Gottlieb. There is a long time revolving door between government regulators and the pharma industry. This raises all sorts of questions about conflicts of interest, as do royalty payments from pharmaceutical companies to government scientists at the NIH. According to the nonprofit watchdog Open the Books, over 1,800 current and former scientists of the federal government, who are paid their salaries by taxpayers, have received up to $400 million from third-party paid royalties between 2010 and 2020. Think royalties from pharmaceutical companies, for inventions developed while they worked for the National Institutes of Health. The amount of royalties, and I'm not even knocking that they shouldn't get these, although I think you could raise that question. Why are you being paid a salary by taxpayers to develop something, and then you get all this money? Well, it shouldn't be the taxpayers if you're doing that. But let's put that aside. The amount of royalties paid to specific government scientists is largely secret, which doesn't even allow the public to know whether a government policymaker like Mr. Fauci or Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, doesn't even allow you to know if a government policymaker may have a conflict of interest in decisions they are influencing about authorizing certain drugs. Or let's deal with the issue of transparency. It turns out that the NIH, National Institutes of Health, has spent nearly $3 million of your tax dollars to support a tissue hub at the University of Pittsburgh that harvested human fetal tissue from aborted babies ranging from 6 to 42 weeks of gestation. I mean, 42 weeks is after term. But we didn't learn about this funding until late last year. Why? Because the NIH, under then director, evangelical Christian Francis Collins, tried to hide it. In fact, Collins' NIH dragged its feet on producing documents requested under the Freedom of Information Act. And a group, Judicial Watch, had to file a lawsuit to learn this. This is one of many examples where government scientists at the NIH in particular have been less than transparent. Final example of the sorts of conduct that needs accountability. In the spring of last year, vaccines were being rolled out. Many people were concerned about government mandates for vaccines, especially at the federal level, but also at the local level, which we experienced in Washington state. Again, Francis Collins, the nation's top scientist, during an online town hall, made this rather emphatic promise at the end of April last year. And if I were showing this in my keynote, I'd be playing it for you. Quote, "There's not going to be any mandating of vaccines from the US government, I can assure you," unquote. Well, as from hearing from the laughter, I know that you know what we all know. Just a few months later, literally just a few months later, Collins himself was publicly advocating vaccine mandates, including ones imposed by the federal government, and his support for federal vaccine mandates became increasingly aggressive in following months. So let me just say that if you're concerned about people losing trust in science, and if you may be here, or if you're watching online and you're saying, "Oh, how dare I say this?" If you're angry, I'd want to say, why aren't you? Or if you're angry at me for saying this, why aren't you angry about someone who makes a statement like that turns out to be patently untrue? And if you're saying, "Oh, I'm sowing distrust about scientific experts," if you're really concerned about people having trust in science, it's not because people like me or others are raising issues. You should be concerned about people like Francis Collins. If you actually tell people point blank, you assure them we're not going to have mandates, and then you turn around within months and do the opposite, what kind of impact does that actually have on public trust in science? Similarly, on the masks, probably the biggest thing that was eye-opening for people, you cannot spend 2 months or more saying that wearing masks are evil and that actually it will be counterproductive and harmful, and then turn around really without no new studies or new evidence, and then assert the opposite and not realize that ordinary people looking at that are going to say, So if you're really concerned and passionate about building trust in science, you've got to get the house in order. Anyway, scientists who do things like what I've just showed need to be held accountable. Final, fifth recommendation, we need to make the case that scientists alone shouldn't dictate public policy. With all due respect to science, and again, I'm not attacking science. Science is a wonderful thing. And scientists are wonderful, but they're not perfect. They're sinful just like all the rest of us. And so, again, the normal checks and balances need to apply. With all due respect to science, it really isn't in its purview to rule. Being an expert is not enough. Dwight Eisenhower was a general who helped push back the Nazis during World War II, along with other generals. He later became a two-term American president. In 1961, he gave a farewell address that in popular culture has been mostly remembered because he warned about the rise of what he called a military-industrial complex that could be a threat to free society. What is not usually remembered is another warning from that speech. And again, if I had the visuals, I would actually play it for you. But here's what he said. In holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. Unquote. I think Eisenhower was prophetic, and we ignore his warning at our peril. Yes, scientists should advise us, but most public policy questions aren't just science questions. For example, whether to shut down the country or impose medical mandates are not just science questions, and so scientists should have the only voices at the table when answering them, and certainly just a certain group of scientists shouldn't have it, because insofar as science does have something to say, you want a diverse set of people to present the evidence. To cite C.S. Lewis again, government involves questions about the good for man and justice, and what things are worth having at what price, and on these, a scientific training gives a man's opinion no added value. Thank you.